For my granddaughter Mia's 8th birthday, my son's wealthy in-laws sent her a seemingly innocent teddy bear. At first she was ecstatic, hugging the soft brown fur as if it were the best thing in the world. But later that evening, when I picked the toy up from the living room floor, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just the unusual weight distribution that triggered my instincts as a retired security officer. It was the faint, rhythmic red pulse I saw deep within the plastic left eye of the bear. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I took the bear to my garage and started digging. What I found inside that toy wasn't just cotton stuffing. It was a felony. 3 days later, when the police and federal agents surrounded the Harringtons' estate during their country club gala, they realized too late that they had made a fatal mistake. You never declare war on a man who spent 40 years building surveillance systems for the government. Before I tell you how I dismantled their entire life using their own trap, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from toxic relatives who thought money gave them the right to control everything. My 1998 Chevrolet Silverado rattled slightly as I idled at the massive wrought iron gates of the Oaks, an exclusive gated community in Virginia. The truck has seen better days, with rust eating away at the wheel wells and a faded bumper sticker from my days in the Marine Corps, but the engine is pristine. I take care of what matters, unlike the people I was about to visit. I rolled down the window, letting the humid afternoon air fill the cab. The security guard, a young man who looked like he spent more time styling his hair than checking protocols, stepped out of his booth. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my truck, then at the oil stain on the pavement beneath my exhaust pipe, and his nose wrinkled in immediate disgust. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, though the tone suggested I was lost or looking for a handout. "Deliveries and maintenance crews need to use the service entrance on the north side. You cannot block the resident lane." "I am not maintenance," I said, keeping my voice level. "I am here for Mia Carter's birthday party at 402 Willow Creek Lane. I am William Carter, her grandfather." The guard let out a short, mocking laugh as he looked down at his clipboard. He didn't even pretend to check the list thoroughly. "I don't see a William Carter here." "Look, Pops, the landscaping crew already checked in this morning. If you're late, that's on you, but don't lie to me. Turn this heap around before I call the patrol car." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to tell him that I was the one who provided the down payment for that house at 402 Willow Creek. I wanted to tell him that the security system he was using to monitor the gate was running on a patch code I wrote 10 years ago. But I learned a long time ago that revealing your hand too early is a tactical error. Just as I was about to reach for my phone to call my son Daniel, a horn blared aggressively behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror. A silver Bentley Continental GT, polished to a mirror shine, was right on my bumper. The driver leaned on the horn again, long and impatient. The guard's demeanor changed instantly. He went from arrogant gatekeeper to subservient servant in a split second. He waved frantically at me to move aside. I had to pull my truck up onto the grass verge just to clear the lane. The Bentley rolled forward smoothly. The window slid down, revealing Richard Harrington. He was wearing a linen suit that probably cost more than my truck. Beside him was his wife, Sylvia, dripping in pearls, looking at my vehicle with the same expression one would look at roadkill. Richard didn't even look at me. He looked at the guard and smiled, handing him a crisp $50 bill. "Sorry about the obstruction, son," Richard said, his voice loud enough for me to hear. "It is so hard to find good help these days. Some people just don't know their place." "Oh, Mr. Harrington, good to see you," the guard stammered, pocketing the cash. "Go right through. I was just dealing with this confusion." Sylvia laughed, a high-pitched sound like breaking glass. She finally turned her head and locked eyes with me. Her smile was sharp, predatory. "Oh, hello, William," she said, feigning surprise. "I didn't recognize you in that thing. We thought you were the pool cleaner. Do try to park on the street, won't you? We don't want oil stains on Daniel's driveway." The Bentley accelerated, purring through the open gates. The guard looked back at me, emboldened by their dismissal. "You heard them," he sneered. "I'll let you in this one time, but park on the street." I shifted my truck into gear and drove through the gates. My heart wasn't racing from anger. It was slowing down, entering the cold, calculated rhythm I hadn't felt since my retirement. Richard and Sylvia thought this was just a social game. They thought they could humiliate me because I drove an old truck and wore flannel shirts. They had no idea that they had just insulted the only person standing between them and total ruin. I drove slowly toward my son's house, noting the security camera angles as I passed them. The war had started, and they didn't even know they were on the battlefield. The double doors to the main hall were wide open, spilling out the sound of a string quartet that likely cost more for the afternoon than my monthly pension check. I stepped inside, instinctively wiping my boots on the welcome mat, conscious of the grease stain on my left toe. The air smelled of imported lilies and expensive perfume, a cloying mixture that made the back of my throat itch. In the center of the room, under a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of crystal, stood Richard and Sylvia Harrington. They were holding court like royalty in a room full of subjects. Richard was recounting a golf story to a circle of men in pastel linen suits, gesturing broadly with a flute of champagne. The men laughed on cue, a hollow, practiced sound that I recognized from years of sitting in boardrooms with people who had more ambition than integrity. I scanned the room for my son. Daniel was standing near the bar, looking pale and sweating despite the air conditioning. He was clutching a glass of water like a lifeline, his eyes darting nervously toward his in-laws every few seconds. He looked like a man waiting for a bomb to go off. Before I could reach him, Richard spotted me. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a facial spasm, a tightening of muscles designed to mimic welcome while signaling hostility. He excused himself from his circle and glided over, intercepting me with the efficiency of a bouncer. "Bill," he said, using the nickname I had told him a dozen times I hated. "You actually made it. I was worried the security at the gate might have turned you away. They are very strict about aesthetic standards in the community." He didn't offer his hand. He just stood there, blocking my path, sipping his Dom Perignon. "I am here for Mia," I said, keeping my voice low. "Of course," Sylvia chimed in, appearing at Richard's elbow in a silk dress that rustled like dry leaves. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my flannel shirt with a mixture of pity and amusement. "We were just telling the senator about the party." "Oh, don't worry, Bill. We didn't seat you at the main table. We know how uncomfortable you get around complex silverware." She pointed a manicured finger toward the far corner of the room, near the swinging kitchen doors where the catering staff were rushing in and out with trays of hors d'oeuvres. There was a small, unsteady folding table set up there, isolated from the rest of the party. It didn't have a name card. It didn't even have a proper tablecloth. "We thought you would prefer the quiet," Richard added, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. A squeeze that was meant to be dominant. "Plus, you will be closer to the service exit when you need to step out for fresh air, or a cigarette, or whatever it is you do." I looked at the table, then back at Richard. In my head, I was calculating the structural weaknesses of his knee joint. but I forced my muscles to relax. I wasn't going to give them the scene they wanted. Not yet. "That is thoughtful of you, Richard," I said, my voice flat. I walked past them, head high, toward the isolation table. As I sat down, turning my back to the kitchen traffic, I watched them return to their circle. They laughed again, and this time I knew the joke was on me. But as I watched Richard refill his glass, I noticed something else. His hand was trembling. Just a fraction. A micro-tremor. The kind of tremor a man has when he is juggling too many lies and the balls are about to drop. I sat in my exile, crossed my arms, and started to watch. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute cut through the chatter, signaling the start of the main event. Richard stood in the center of the room, basking in the attention as he announced it was time for the presents. I waited until the other guests had piled their extravagant boxes on the table. Designer clothes, the latest tablets, electric scooters, before I stepped forward. My gift was not wrapped in gold foil or tied with silk ribbons. It was a simple beige envelope containing a bank passbook. I walked over to where Mia was sitting on a velvet throne-like chair. "Happy birthday, sweet pea," I said softly, handing her the envelope. She opened it, her brow furrowing slightly as she pulled out the small booklet. Sylvia swooped in like a hawk before Mia could even ask what it was. She snatched the book from my granddaughter's hands and opened it, scanning the first page. A dry, cruel laugh escaped her lips. "Oh, look, everyone! A savings account with a starting balance of $500. She held it up for the room to see, pinching the corner of the book as if it were soiled. "How quaint, William. I suppose this is meant to teach her the value of loose change?" The room erupted in polite, mocking laughter. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I kept my voice steady. "It is for her future, Sylvia. Compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe if you start early." Richard stepped in, placing a hand on my back and physically steering me away from Mia. "We will make sure she buys some gum with it, Bill. Now, let's show her what real love looks like." He clapped his hands, and two waiters brought out a massive box wrapped in shimmering purple paper. Mia tore into it, screaming with delight as she pulled out a golden envelope. "VIP passes to Disney World," Richard announced, his voice booming. "First class, 5-star resort, the works. You, me, and Grandma are going next week, Princess." Mia shrieked and hugged them both, burying her face in Sylvia's silk dress. I stood to the side, clutching my empty envelope, feeling invisible. But they weren't finished. "And one more thing," Sylvia said, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She reached behind the table and produced a teddy bear. It wasn't just any bear. It was a dark brown, vintage-style bear with articulating limbs and eyes that seemed too realistic for a toy. "We had this flown in from a private artisan in Munich," she purred. "There are only 50 of these in the world. It is made of alpaca fur and hypoallergenic fibers." Mia gasped, abandoning the Disney tickets to grab the bear. She squeezed it tight, rubbing her cheek against its soft head. "I love it," she cried out. "I love it more than anything. Thank you, Grandpa Richard. Thank you, Grandma." She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the passbook lying forgotten on the floor near Richard's Italian leather shoes. As Mia hugged that bear, Richard looked over her shoulder, directly at me. He winked. It was a clear message. "You cannot compete with us, old man. You are obsolete." I forced a smile for my granddaughter, but as I watched her clutch that bear, a strange feeling settled in my gut. It wasn't jealousy. It was an instinct honed by 40 years of counterintelligence. There was something about the way the bear's head didn't quite compress naturally against her shoulder. It was too rigid, too structured. But in that moment, surrounded by applause for the Harringtons' generosity, I could do nothing but stand there and swallow the bitter pill of their victory. Or so they thought. The applause from the living room finally died down, replaced by the low hum of expensive conversation and clinking glasses. I slipped away from my isolation table, needing a moment of silence more than I needed the glass of tap water I pretended to fetch. The kitchen was a cavern of stainless steel and white marble, cold and sterile, bustling with catering staff who ignored me as if I were part of the furniture. I leaned against the industrial refrigerator, taking a deep breath, trying to slow the adrenaline that had been building in my system since the gate. A moment later, the swinging door pushed open. Daniel walked in. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He loosened his silk tie with a jerky, desperate motion, his face flushed not from alcohol, but from a suffocating panic. When he saw me, he froze, then slumped against the marble island, burying his face in his hands. "I am sorry about the table, Dad," he mumbled through his fingers. "I am sorry about everything. I tried to tell them to put you with us, but Sylvia said it would mess up the seating chart, and..." I cut him off gently. "Daniel, stop. I do not care about the table. I care about why your hands are shaking. I care about why you look like you haven't slept in a month." He looked up, and the misery in his eyes broke my heart. It was the look of a trapped animal. He checked the door to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice to a frantic whisper. "We are drowning, Dad. The house, the cars, the club memberships. It is all a show. We are 3 months behind on the mortgage. Natalie doesn't know. I have been hiding the notices." I didn't say "I told you so." I didn't remind him that I had warned him about living beyond his means. I just waited. "Richard says he can fix it," Daniel continued, his voice cracking. "He says he has a new development project in Florida. High yield. He says if I invest now, the returns will clear our debt in 6 months. But he needs capital. He wants me to sign over the equity of this house as collateral for a bridge loan. He says if I don't do it tonight, before the party ends, the opportunity is gone. And if I don't, he hinted that they might stop helping Natalie with Mia's school tuition." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. The equity in this house existed only because I had secretly provided the down payment 5 years ago, channeling it through a shell company so Richard wouldn't feel emasculated. Now, the man was trying to cannibalize the very roof over his granddaughter's head to cover his own gambling debts. It wasn't an investment. It was a theft. "I have to sign it, Dad," Daniel whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I don't have a choice. They own us." I walked over and placed my hand on his shoulder. I felt the tension in his frame, the weight of the world crushing him. I didn't tell him about the bear yet. I didn't tell him about the camera I had seen in Richard's eyes. He wasn't ready. "Do not sign anything tonight," I said, my voice low and firm. "Tell him you need to consult a tax attorney first. Tell him whatever lie you need to tell. Just buy me 24 hours. "But Richard is waiting." "Give me 24 hours, Daniel," I repeated, squeezing his shoulder. "I fixed your bicycle when you were 6. I fixed your car when you were 16. Let me fix this." He looked at me, confused, seeing a flash of the father he used to know, before the flannel shirts and the silence. He nodded, wiping his eyes. "Okay, Dad. One day." The kitchen door swung open. A waiter poked his head in. "Mr. Harrington is asking for you, sir. The cake cutting is starting." Daniel straightened his tie, taking a deep breath to put his mask back on. He walked out to play the role of the happy son-in-law. I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the reflection in the stainless steel fridge. They wanted his signature. They wanted his home. But tonight, they were going to get something else entirely. I pushed off the fridge and followed him out. It was time to say goodnight to Mia and to take a closer look at that bear. The last of the catering trucks had finally rumbled down the driveway, leaving the mansion in a silence that felt heavy and artificial. I had been relegated to the downstairs guest suite, a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and disuse, located uncomfortably close to the garage. It was another subtle slight from Richard, putting the old man out of sight. But I didn't mind. It gave me the freedom to move through the house while the rest of the family retreated to the upper wings. I couldn't sleep. The image of Daniel's terrified face in the kitchen kept playing on a loop in my mind, mixing with the smug satisfaction I had seen on Sylvia's face. Around midnight, I decided to check on Mia. It was a habit from when Daniel was a boy, a need to ensure the perimeter was secure before I could let my own guard down. I walked softly up the grand staircase, my socks making no sound on the plush carpet. The hallway was dimly lit by sconces that cast long, distorted shadows against the silk wallpaper. Mia's door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently, stepping into the room that was painted a soft lavender. She was fast asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic, a stark contrast to the chaos and tension that had filled the house hours earlier. She looked small in the oversized canopy bed, a tiny island of innocence in a sea of debt and deception. Clutched tightly in her arms was the brown teddy bear. Even in the dim light coming from the hallway, the toy looked out of place. It was too stiff, too perfectly groomed. As I watched, Mia shifted in her sleep, rolling over to her side. Her grip loosened, and the bear tumbled from the mattress. It didn't hit the hardwood floor with the soft, muffled thump of cotton and fabric. It hit with a dense, solid clack, a sound that was undeniably metallic. I froze. That sound was wrong. I have spent 40 years handling equipment, weapons, and surveillance gear. I know the acoustic signature of objects. A stuffed animal, even one filled with premium beans or pellets, absorbs impact. It does not resonate. That sound was the sound of a hard casing shielded by a thin layer of fur. I stepped into the room, moving quickly to the bedside. I knelt down and picked up the bear. My hand immediately registered the anomaly. The weight distribution was completely off. The center of gravity wasn't in the belly, where the stuffing should be dense. It was high up, near the chest and head. It was top-heavy. I squeezed the bear's torso. Under the high-quality alpaca fur, I didn't feel the squish of polyester fiber fill. I felt a rigid, rectangular outline. It was buried deep, wrapped in something soft to disguise the edges. But to a hand that had frisked suspects and dismantled bombs, it was as obvious as a brick. I looked at Mia, ensuring she hadn't stirred. Then I looked at the bear's face. In the semi-darkness, the glass eyes seemed to glint with a malice that had nothing to do with toy manufacturing. I turned the bear over, my thumb tracing the seam along the back. It was stitching, yes, but it was machine perfect, too tight. My heart rate didn't spike. It slowed down. This was no longer a birthday gift. This was a device. I stood up, tucking the bear under my arm like a football. I couldn't examine it here. I needed tools, and I needed isolation. I took one last look at my granddaughter, sleeping peacefully, unaware that she had been cuddling with a Trojan horse. I turned and walked out of the room, heading straight for the garage. The party was over, but the operation had just begun. I reached into the glove compartment of my truck and pulled out a burner phone I kept for emergencies. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 2 years. Leonard Kraft picked up on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He just breathed into the line, waiting. That is why I trust him. He is a former undercover narcotics officer who knows that silence is often more important than noise. "I found a listener," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the echo of the garage. "Active transmission, GPS, embedded in a child's toy." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against a floor and keys jingling. "Who is the target?" Leonard asked, his tone shifting from drowsy to lethal instantly. "My granddaughter," I replied. "But the real target is my son. I need a full background sweep on Richard and Sylvia Harrington. Financials, debts, hidden assets. Go deep, Leo. I want to know what they ate for breakfast in 1995. "Consider it done," Leonard said. "I will have the preliminary report by dawn. Do not engage yet, Bill. If they are listening, they are dangerous." I hung up and turned back to the bear. I couldn't destroy the device. If the signal cut out completely, they would know it had been found. I needed to blind them temporarily without making them suspicious. I dug through my tool chest and found a roll of heavy-duty aluminum foil. I wrapped the internal transmitter box in 3 thick layers. It was a crude Faraday cage, but effective. To the listener on the other end, it would sound like static interference or bad reception, not sabotage. Next, I removed their high-capacity memory card and replaced it with a blank one from my dash cam. Let them record silence for a while. Then came the hardest part. I took a needle and a spool of brown thread from my travel sewing kit. I sat under the harsh work light, my reading glasses perched on my nose, and began to stitch the bear back together. My hands, which sometimes shake when I hold a coffee cup, were steady as rock. I matched the original factory stitching perfectly. Loop, pull, knot. Loop, pull, knot. Every puncture of the needle was a promise. They had violated the sanctity of my family. They had weaponized a child's innocence. 20 minutes later, the bear looked untouched. I slipped back into the house like a ghost, navigating the shadows of the hallway until I reached Mia's room. She hadn't moved. I gently lifted her arm and tucked the bear back against her chest. She sighed in her sleep, clutching the device closer. It sickened me, but it was necessary. The bear was no longer a toy. It was now a double agent. I walked out of the house and stood in the driveway, leaning against the cold metal of my truck. I looked up at the Harrington estate on the hill, visible through the trees. The lights were still on in the master suite. Richard and Sylvia were probably up there, drinking their expensive wine, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate my son. They thought they were the apex predators in this valley. I lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating my face for a brief second. They had no idea. They had just invited the wolf into the fold. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in deception. To the outside world, I was just William Carter, the retired grandfather who spent his mornings pruning rose bushes and his afternoons napping in the guest cottage. But inside my head, and on the encrypted laptop hidden under my mattress, a war room was fully operational. I watched Mia play in the garden with that cursed bear. She carried it everywhere, whispering secrets into its artificial ears, unaware that her innocent words were being beamed to a server somewhere. Or at least they would have been, if I had not neutralized the threat. I played the part of the senile old man perfectly, asking Richard the same questions twice and pretending to doze off during dinner, all while memorizing the layout of their home office. On the second afternoon, I met Leonard at a roadside diner 10 miles away from the estate. It was the kind of place where the waitress calls you honey and does not ask questions about why two men are poring over financial spreadsheets in a back booth. Leonard looked older than I remembered. His face lined like a roadmap of bad decisions, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He slid a thick manila envelope across the Formica table. "You were right, Bill," he said, keeping his voice low enough to be lost under the hum of the refrigerator. "The Harringtons are not just underwater. They are chained to an anchor at the bottom of the Mariana Trench." I opened the file. The numbers were staggering. Richard and Sylvia had been living a lie for the past decade. Their construction business had folded 2 years ago, a detail they conveniently forgot to mention to the local society pages. They were surviving on a rotation of 12 different high-interest credit cards and predatory loans. "Look at page 3, Leonard said, tapping the paper with a callous finger. I looked. It was a foreclosure notice from the bank. It was dated 3 months ago. The bank was not just threatening to take their house. They had already started the proceedings. The mansion, the Bentley, the country club membership, it was all smoke and mirrors. They had zero equity. In fact, they were negative $4.5 million. "So why the bear?" I asked, though the answer was already forming in my gut. "Why spy on my son? Daniel is not rich. He makes a decent living as an architect, but he does not have the kind of capital that solves a $4 million problem." Leonard took a sip of his black coffee and flipped to the last page. "Because of this," he said. It was a copy of Mia's trust fund deed, the one I had set up when she was born, funneling the royalties from my patents into a protected account. I had made Daniel the trustee, but I had kept the existence of the principal amount quiet. "They know about the trust," Leonard said, "but they do not know the access codes, and they do not know the exact amount. They are phishing, Bill. They are listening for passwords, for account numbers, for anything that lets them crack that piggy bank. They view your granddaughter as a winning lottery ticket." I closed the folder, feeling a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the diner food. It was not just greed, it was predation. They were willing to bug a child's bedroom to steal her future. I looked out the window at my rusted truck. I had spent a lifetime building armor to protect my country, but I realized the most dangerous enemies were not foreign agents. They were the people smiling at you across the dinner table. "Keep digging," I told Leonard. "Find out who holds their debt. I want to know the name of every loan shark and bank manager they owe." "Why?" Leonard asked. "Because," I said, standing up and throwing a $20 bill on the table, "I am not just going to stop them. I am going to buy them." The peace lasted exactly 48 hours. It was a fragile, suffocating silence that shattered at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was the only one awake, sitting in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee, watching the fog roll over the lawn. I saw them before I heard them. 2 vehicles pulled into the driveway without sirens, but their presence screamed authority. One was a standard police cruiser, the other a nondescript sedan that I recognized immediately as a government vehicle. The pounding on the front door was not a request. It was a demand. I stayed in the kitchen, motionless, listening as Daniel stumbled down the stairs. I heard the confusion in his voice as he unlocked the door, followed immediately by the sharp, sterile tone of official procedure. "Mr. Daniel Carter, I am Agent Miller with Child Protective Services. We have received a credible report regarding the immediate safety of a minor in this household. We have an emergency removal order for Mia Carter." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. I heard Daniel gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. Removal. Not an investigation, not a question, a removal. I walked into the hallway just as Natalie came running down the stairs, tying her robe, her eyes wide with panic. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, blocking the doorway with their bodies. Agent Miller, a woman with tired eyes and a clipboard that held the power to destroy families, did not look at them with sympathy. She looked at them like they were criminals. "This is a mistake," Daniel stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for the paper she was holding. "We have never hurt Mia. Who called you? You cannot just take my daughter. We received an anonymous tip, accompanied by digital evidence," the agent said, her voice devoid of emotion. "We have audio recordings of verbal abuse and threats of physical violence." She tapped her phone screen and played a clip. The sound was tinny, but the voice was unmistakably Daniel's. "If you do not stop crying right now, I will give you something to cry about. Eat your food or you will starve in this room." Daniel's face went white. Natalie screamed, covering her mouth. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, my grip tightening on my coffee mug until I thought the ceramic would shatter. I recognized those sentences. I knew exactly when Daniel had said them. But he hadn't said them together. The first sentence was from a month ago, when he was joking with the dog who was whining for scraps. The second sentence was from a dinner 2 weeks ago, when he was frustrated that Mia wouldn't eat her vegetables. They had edited the tape. The Harringtons hadn't just been listening. They had been cutting, splicing, and rearranging my son's life into a horror movie. They had weaponized his own voice against him. "Officer, please secure the child," Agent Miller instructed. "No!" Natalie shrieked, lunging forward. The police officer caught her arm, not gently. "Ma'am, step back. Do not make this worse." I stepped forward then, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder before he could do something stupid. He looked at me, his eyes begging for me to fix it, to use my old connections, to do something. But I saw the trap. If we resisted now, they would charge us with obstruction. If I revealed the bear now, without the full financial evidence Leonard was gathering, it would look like a desperate fabrication by a guilty grandfather. "Let them do their job, Daniel," I said, my voice sounding calm even though a fire was raging in my gut. "Call your lawyer. We will fight this in court." Mia appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing her eyes, clutching that damned bear. When she saw the police, she started to cry. As the officer led her out of the house, leaving my son and daughter-in-law collapsing in each other's arms, I looked out the window. Parked just down the street, barely visible through the morning mist, was a silver Bentley. Richard and Sylvia were watching. They had triggered the nuclear option. They didn't just want to win. They wanted to annihilate us. Watching my granddaughter be led into the back of a government sedan was the single most painful moment of my life. It hurt more than the shrapnel I took in the Gulf. Mia wasn't crying anymore. She had gone silent, entering a state of shock that I recognized all too well. She pressed her face against the cold glass of the window, her small hand clutching that cursed teddy bear, looking at her father with eyes that asked a question he couldn't answer. "Why are you letting them take me?" Natalie didn't handle it with silence. She shattered. As the car pulled away, she collapsed onto the driveway, her knees hitting the asphalt with a sickening thud. She screamed for her baby, a raw, animalistic sound that tore through the morning mist. Daniel tried to reach for her, to comfort her, but she flinched away from his touch as if he were made of fire. The audio recording had done its job. Even though she loved him, a seed of terror had been planted in her mind. She looked at him not as her husband, but as the monster on the tape. Then, as if on cue, the silver Bentley rolled up the driveway. The timing was surgical. They hadn't been down the street. They had been waiting for the signal. Richard and Sylvia Harrington stepped out of the car, dressed in somber, respectable clothes that contrasted sharply with our pajamas and panic. They didn't look shocked. They looked prepared. Sylvia bypassed me and Daniel completely. She went straight to Natalie, scooping her up from the ground with a maternal embrace that looked comforting, but felt like a capture. "Oh, my poor sweet darling," Sylvia cooed, stroking Natalie's hair. "We told you it might come to this. We told you he was unstable. You are safe now. Mommy is here." Richard walked up to Agent Miller, who was still filling out paperwork by her car. He didn't introduce himself. He spoke with the entitlement of a man who had already made the arrangements. "We are the maternal grandparents," he stated, handing her a business card. "We have already spoken to the caseworker. We have a suite ready for our daughter and granddaughter. We are asserting our right to kinship care immediately. We do not want Mia spending a single hour in a state facility." Agent Miller nodded, looking relieved that she wouldn't have to deal with the paperwork of a foster home. "As long as the background check clears, which I see here is already expedited, I can release the child to your custody pending the hearing on Thursday." It was a handover. A hostile takeover of a family disguised as a rescue mission. Richard finally turned to look at Daniel. He didn't yell. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was far worse. "You need help, son," Richard said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "We are taking Natalie and Mia to the Oaks. Do not try to contact them. Do not come to the house. You have done enough damage." They loaded Natalie into the back of the Bentley like a piece of luggage. She didn't look back at Daniel. She was broken, and they were the ones holding the glue. As they drove away, following the CPS car, Daniel stood alone in the driveway. A man stripped of his wife, his child, and his dignity in under 20 minutes. He fell to his knees and wept. I didn't weep. I watched the Bentley disappear, and I felt a cold resolve harden in my chest. They had taken the hostages to the stronghold, but they had forgotten one thing. They had also taken the listening device. The bear was going with them, and now I was going to hear every word they said in their moment of victory. The silence left behind was heavier than the noise. Daniel stood in the middle of the living room, clutching his phone like a lifeline. He dialed Natalie's number again, and again, and again. Each time, the result was the same: a mechanical click, followed by the sterile notification that the subscriber was unavailable. They hadn't just taken her physically, they had severed the digital connection instantly. He threw the phone onto the sofa with a guttural roar of frustration. It bounced off the cushions and slid onto the floor, a useless brick of glass and plastic. "I am going over there," Daniel announced, his voice trembling with a dangerous mix of grief and rage. He snatched his car keys from the bowl near the door. "I am going to kick down their front door, and I am going to take my family back." He moved toward the exit, his stride long and aggressive. He looked like a man ready to commit a felony. He looked exactly like the man the Harringtons wanted him to be. I didn't shout. I didn't chase him. I simply stepped in front of the door, blocking his path with my body. "Move, Dad," Daniel warned, his eyes wild. "Do not stop me." I didn't move. I looked at him, seeing the little boy who used to scrape his knees, now grown into a desperate man about to walk into a buzzsaw. "If you walk out that door," I said, my voice low and hard as granite, "you are doing exactly what Richard wants. He has security cameras covering every inch of that driveway. He has already called the police to warn them that his unstable son-in-law might try to violate the restraining order. You go there, you shout, you pound on the door, and 10 minutes later you were in handcuffs. And then, Daniel, you prove that the audio recording was right. You prove you are the monster they say you are." Daniel stopped. His chest heaved. "But they have Mia," he choked out, tears streaming down his face again. "They have my girls." I grabbed his wrist. The grip was firm, grounding him. "I know. And we are going to get them back. But not with your fists. We do not fight a war on the enemy's terms. We fight on ours." I led him away from the door, guiding him back to the kitchen table. I pushed him into a chair. He slumped forward, burying his head in his hands. "So what do we do?" he whispered. "We have nothing. They have the money, they have the lawyers, they have the system." I walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a bottle of cheap whiskey. I didn't pour him a drink. I poured it down the sink. Then I filled the coffee pot with water. "We have something better," I said, turning on the machine. "We have the truth. And we have patience. Now, wipe your face. Stop crying. Tears are for victims. You are not a victim today. You are a soldier. And I'm going to show you the battle plan." I reached into my bag and pulled out the laptop Leonard had given me. I opened it, the screen glowing blue in the dim kitchen. "Look at this, Daniel. Look at what your rich, powerful in-laws are actually worth." Daniel looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He focused on the screen. He saw the negative balances. He saw the foreclosure notices. Confusion replaced the panic. "They are broke," he whispered. "Worse," I said, handing him a mug of black coffee. "They are desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Now drink this. We have work to do." We drove in silence to an industrial park on the edge of town, a place where the buildings were gray concrete blocks and the windows were barred. Leonard did not work out of a noir-style office with Venetian blinds and a bottle of scotch. He worked out of a server farm disguised as a logistics company. Inside, the hum of cooling fans was the only sound, a constant white noise that swallowed secrets. Leonard met us at the steel security door. He didn't offer Daniel a handshake or a condolence. He just nodded at me and led us into a room lined with monitors. He tapped a few keys on a keyboard that looked like it belonged in a cockpit, and a spreadsheet filled the main screen. "Gentlemen," Leonard said, his voice dry as dust, "you asked me to dig. I did not just dig. I hit the sewer line." Daniel stared at the screen, squinting at the rows of red numbers. "I don't understand," he murmured. "What is this?" "This," Leonard said, pointing a pen at the bottom line, "is the current net worth of Richard and Sylvia Harrington. Negative $4.5 million. Daniel blinked. "That is impossible. They have the house, the cars, the club." "They just bought Mia a trip to Disney." "All credit," Leonard corrected. "They are maxed out on 14 different lines of credit. They have refinanced that mansion 3 times in the last 5 years. But here is the kicker." He brought up a scanned document. It was a legal notice, stamped with the seal of the county clerk. "This is a notice of default," Leonard explained. "It was filed 48 hours ago. The bank is not just threatening foreclosure. They have scheduled the auction. They have exactly 30 days to come up with $200,000 in arrears, or the sheriff puts a padlock on the gate of the Oaks. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. It all made sense now. The urgency, the desperation, the sudden need to take custody of Mia. They didn't want a granddaughter. They wanted a life raft. They need the trust fund, I said, looking at Daniel. They know I set up the account for Mia. They know the monthly interest payout is roughly $40,000. If they get custody, they get control of that cash flow. That is how they plan to pay the mortgage. Daniel sank into a chair, looking physically ill. He had spent years feeling inferior to them. He had let them belittle him, criticize his job, and undermine his parenting because he bought into the illusion of their success. And all this time, they were just parasites looking for a new host. They are using my daughter as a mortgage payment, Daniel whispered, his voice shaking with a new kind of anger. Not the explosive rage from the morning, but something colder, something more dangerous. Exactly, I said, and that is their weakness. They are on a clock. They have 30 days before their world collapses. They are terrified, and terrified people are careless. Leonard pulled up one last document. It was a list of their creditors, but there was one name that stood out. It wasn't a bank. It was a private equity firm known for buying distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. I know this firm, I said, a plan forming in my mind. They are sharks. They don't care about sob stories. They just want their money or the asset. I turned to Daniel. You wanted to kick down their door? I have a better idea. We are not going to kick it down. We are going to buy the lock. And then we are going to be the ones deciding who gets to stay inside. Leonard, get me the contact number for that equity firm. I have some retirement savings that I suddenly feel the urge to invest. Leonard tapped a few keys and the screen shifted from the foreclosure notices to a document I knew well. It was the deed to the irrevocable trust I had established for Mia the day she was born. I had buried it deep, using a holding company in Delaware to keep my name off the public records. But the Harringtons had found it. They had likely hired a forensic accountant months ago, sniffing around for any scrap of money they could devour. Look at Article 7, subsection C, Leonard said, highlighting a paragraph of dense legal text. This is the loophole they are exploiting. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the words. The clause was standard for this type of trust, designed to ensure the child was cared for if something happened to the parents. It read that, in the event the primary trustee is removed due to legal incapacitation or loss of custody, the court-appointed legal guardian shall assume discretionary control over the monthly interest yields for the maintenance, education, and general welfare of the beneficiary. Discretionary control. That was the magic phrase. I did the math aloud, my voice echoing in the quiet server room. The principal is $10 million. Even with a conservative yield of 5%, that generates roughly $500,000 a year. That breaks down to just over $41,000 a month. Daniel stared at the screen, his face pale. $41,000, he repeated, the number rolling off his tongue like a curse. That is exactly the amount of their monthly overhead. I saw their budget once by accident. Between the mortgage on the Oaks, the lease on the Bentley, and the country club dues, it comes to about $40,000. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, looking sick. They didn't take Mia because they were worried about her safety. They didn't take her because they thought I was a bad father. They took her because she is a paycheck. She is a walking, talking mortgage payment. It was sickeningly brilliant. By framing Daniel for abuse and getting temporary custody, they became the de facto guardians. Once the court finalized the arrangement, They could petition the trustee to release the monthly funds for Mia's upkeep. They could use that money to pay their debts, claiming it was for her housing and lifestyle expenses. They would drain her future to fund their present. "They are vampires," I said, the anger in my chest turning into a cold, hard resolve. "They are willing to destroy a little girl's family just to keep up appearances at a golf club." Daniel looked up at me, and for the first time, the despair in his eyes was replaced by a burning hatred. "They are not going to get a dime," he said. "I will burn that money before I let them touch it." "No," I said, closing the laptop. "We are not going to burn it. We are going to use it as bait. But first, we need the one person who can dismantle their character witness defense. We need Natalie." "She is with them," Daniel said, shaking his head. "They have her locked up in that house. She thinks I am a monster. She won't talk to me." "She won't talk to you," I agreed. "But she might talk to me." The Harringtons think they have won. They think we are defeated. That makes them arrogant. And right now, Natalie is the only loose thread in their perfect tapestry. We need to pull that thread before they cut it. Leonard, find out where they are keeping her. I have a feeling she is not as free as they claim. Getting to Natalie was not going to be like storming a beachhead. It had to be a surgical extraction of a hostage who didn't even know she was being held. Leonard and I spent the next 6 hours parked in a nondescript utility van 300 yards down the winding hill from the Harrington estate. Through the high-powered lens of Leonard's tactical spotting scope, I watched the slow, systematic destruction of my daughter-in-law. The Harringtons were not beating her physically. They were doing something far more insidious. They were rewriting her memory. I saw them on the sprawling stone terrace overlooking the golf course. Natalie was sitting in a white wicker chair, her posture slumped, staring blankly at the manicured lawn. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, as if the last 48 hours had physically eroded her spine. Sylvia was pacing back and forth in front of her, a glass of wine in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other. Her mouth was moving in a relentless, rapid-fire rhythm. I didn't need a parabolic microphone to know exactly what she was saying. She was pouring poison into Natalie's ear. She was reinforcing the narrative of the audio tape. She was telling her that Daniel was unstable, that his financial stress had turned him into a ticking time bomb, and that she was lucky to have escaped with her life. At one point, Natalie stood up, perhaps to walk to the railing, to find a moment of peace away from her mother's voice. Immediately, Richard appeared from the sliding glass doors. He didn't hit her. He didn't yell. He simply placed a heavy hand on her shoulder and guided her back to the chair. It looked gentle from a distance, the actions of a concerned father. But through the scope, I saw the force in his grip. I saw the way Natalie flinched and shrank away from his touch. They were terrified that if she had a single moment of clarity, a single second of silence to think for herself, their whole charade would collapse. They needed her afraid. They needed her dependent. They needed her to believe that the prison they had built for her was actually a fortress. "She is a prisoner of war," Leonard muttered from the driver's seat, adjusting the focus on the digital camera. "They have isolated her from her support network, likely sleep-deprived her, and are now flooding her with propaganda. It is classic brainwashing techniques applied to domestic custody." I watched as a maid brought out a tray of food. Natalie didn't touch it. She just sat there, a statue of grief in a gilded cage. I realized then that we couldn't just call her phone. They had almost certainly confiscated it, probably under the guise of protecting her from Daniel's harassment. If I tried to approach the front gate, Richard would call the police instantly and claim I was violating the restraining order by proxy. I needed to get her alone. I needed 5 minutes in a neutral zone where the Harrington's shadow couldn't reach. Then, I saw it. The break in the pattern. The silver SUV in the driveway flashed its lights as the remote starter was engaged. Sylvia came out, handing Natalie a set of keys and a small piece of paper. She pointed aggressively toward the main road. Natalie nodded, looking exhausted, and grabbed her purse. They were sending her on an errand. Perhaps to the pharmacy for nerves, or to the grocery store for some specific item Sylvia demanded. It was a test. They were testing the length of the leash. Natalie got into the driver's seat. She was alone. This was it. The window of opportunity was opening, and it might only stay open for 20 minutes. I tapped Leonard on the shoulder. "Start the engine," I said, my eyes fixed on the silver car pulling out of the gates. "We are going to follow her. I am going to remind her who the real monsters are." Getting to Natalie was not going to be like storming a beachhead. It had to be a surgical extraction of a hostage who didn't even know she was being held. Leonard and I spent the next 6 hours parked in a nondescript utility van 300 yards down the winding hill from the Harrington estate. Through the high-powered lens of Leonard's tactical spotting scope, I watched the slow, systematic destruction of my daughter-in-law. The Harringtons were not beating her physically. They were doing something far more insidious. They were rewriting her memory. I saw them on the sprawling stone terrace overlooking the golf course. Natalie was sitting in a white wicker chair, her posture slumped, staring blankly at the manicured lawn. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, as if the last 48 hours had physically eroded her spine. Sylvia was pacing back and forth in front of her, a glass of wine in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other. Her mouth was moving in a relentless, rapid-fire rhythm. I didn't need a parabolic microphone to know exactly what she was saying. She was pouring poison into Natalie's ear. She was reinforcing the narrative of the audio tape. She was telling her that Daniel was unstable, that his financial stress had turned him into a ticking time bomb, and that she was lucky to have escaped with her life. At one point, Natalie stood up, perhaps to walk to the railing, to find a moment of peace away from her mother's voice. Immediately, Richard appeared from the sliding glass doors. He didn't hit her. He didn't yell. He simply placed a heavy hand on her shoulder and guided her back to the chair. It looked gentle from a distance, the actions of a concerned father. But through the scope, I saw the force in his grip. I saw the way Natalie flinched and shrank away from his touch. They were terrified that if she had a single moment of clarity, a single second of silence to think for herself, their whole charade would collapse. They needed her afraid. They needed her dependent. They needed her to believe that the prison they had built for her was actually a fortress. "She is a prisoner of war," Leonard muttered from the driver's seat, adjusting the focus on the digital camera. "They have isolated her from her support network, likely sleep-deprived her, and are now flooding her with propaganda. It is classic brainwashing techniques applied to domestic custody." I watched as a maid brought out a tray of food. Natalie didn't touch it. She just sat there, a statue of grief in a gilded cage. I realized then that we couldn't just call her phone. They had almost certainly confiscated it, probably under the guise of protecting her from Daniel's harassment. If I tried to approach the front gate, Richard would call the police instantly and claim I was violating the restraining order by proxy. I needed to get her alone. I needed 5 minutes in a neutral zone where the Harrington's shadow couldn't reach. Then I saw it, the break in the pattern. The silver SUV in the driveway flashed its lights as the remote starter was engaged. Sylvia came out, handing Natalie a set of keys and a small piece of paper. She pointed aggressively toward the main road. Natalie nodded, looking exhausted, and grabbed her purse. They were sending her on an errand. Perhaps to the pharmacy for nerves, or to the grocery store for some specific item Sylvia demanded. It was a test. They were testing the length of the leash. Natalie got into the driver's seat. She was alone. This was it. The window of opportunity was opening, and it might only stay open for 20 minutes. I tapped Leonard on the shoulder. "Start the engine," I said, my eyes fixed on the silver car pulling out of the gates. "We are going to follow her. I am going to remind her who the real monsters are." I waited until she was in aisle 4, staring blankly at a selection of imported pasta sauces. It was the most mundane setting possible for a meeting that would decide the fate of my family. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the dark psychological game being played at the Harrington estate. Natalie looked terrible. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her skin pale, and she gripped the handle of the shopping cart so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't shopping for herself. I saw the items in the cart: expensive Pinot Noir, truffle oil, artichoke hearts. She was running errands for her captors. I stepped out from behind a display of organic crackers. "Natalie," I said softly. She jumped as if I had tasered her. She spun around, dropping a jar of sauce. It shattered on the linoleum, red liquid spreading like a crime scene. "Stay away from me," she whispered, backing up until she hit the shelf. "My father said you would try to find me. He said you and Daniel are dangerous. He said I should scream if I saw you." I didn't move closer. I didn't want to trigger the panic response Sylvia had programmed into her. I stood my ground, hands visible, calm and steady. "I am not going to hurt you, Natalie," I said, keeping my voice level. "And Daniel is not dangerous. You know that deep down. You lived with him for 10 years. Did he ever raise a hand to you? Ever?" "He threatened Mia," she stammered, tears spilling over. "I heard the tape. I heard him say he would give her a reason to cry." I reached into my jacket. Natalie flinched, preparing for violence. I pulled out a tablet. "You heard a tape," I corrected. "Now I want you to see the reality." I pressed play. The screen showed the living room of my house, recorded from the security camera I had installed above the bookshelf 3 years ago. The timestamp was from 2 weeks prior. In the video, our golden retriever, Buster, was chewing on the leg of the sofa. Daniel walked in, looking tired. He clapped his hands and shouted, "Hey, stop that! If you do not stop crying for attention, I will give you something to cry about." He then grabbed a chew toy and threw it into the yard. I paused the video. Then, I played the audio clip Agent Miller had used. The words were the same, but the sound of the dog barking had been stripped out, and the word "attention" had been cut. "They edited it, Natalie," I said, watching the realization crash over her. "They took his voice and they built a monster. And they did it with a microphone hidden inside the teddy bear they gave Mia for her birthday." Natalie stared at the screen, her mouth trembling. She looked at the shattered sauce on the floor, then back at me. "Why?" she choked out. "Why would they do that? They are my parents. They have everything." I swiped the screen to the financial documents Leonard had uncovered. "They have nothing," I said brutally. "They are $4 million in debt. They are stealing your daughter because her trust fund pays $40,000 a month. You are not a daughter to them right now, Natalie. You are an ATM." She slid down the shelving unit, crouching on the floor, ignoring the mess around her. The horror on her face wasn't fear of Daniel anymore. It was the devastating heartbreak of a child realizing her parents were wolves. She buried her face in her knees and sobbed, but this time it wasn't the cry of a victim. It was the cry of someone waking up. I knelt beside her, disregarding the stares of a passing shopper. "You can stay on the floor and let them win," I whispered. "Or you can wipe your face, finish their shopping, and help me burn their house of cards to the ground." Natalie looked up. Her mascara was running, but her eyes were hard. "What do I have to do?" she asked. I handed her a small plastic bag containing a new memory card and a tiny screwdriver. "You are going to go back there," I said, "and you are going to fix the bear. We are going to feed them a story they want to hear." Natalie stared at the small plastic bag in her palm as if it contained a live grenade. Inside were the tools of betrayal against the people who had raised her. A tiny screwdriver, a memory card, a needle and thread. For 30 years, she had been conditioned to seek their approval, to fear their judgment, and to believe that their wealth made them morally superior. Breaking that conditioning in the middle of aisle 4 was violent. It was a physical tearing of her reality. "I am not their daughter, am I?" she whispered, her voice sounding hollow. "I am just an asset. I'm just a way for them to keep the Bentley." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the steel that Daniel had fallen in love with. It had been buried under years of gaslighting, but it was still there. "They do not love me," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "They only love what I can give them." I nodded. "It is a hard truth, Natalie, but it is the truth that sets you free. Now listen to me carefully. This is the most dangerous part. You cannot go back there and be angry. If you show even a flicker of resentment, Richard will know. He is a predator, and he smells change in the wind." I stepped closer, lowering my voice until it was barely audible over the hum of the freezer units. "You have to go back and be the broken little girl they want you to be. Cry. Apologize. Let Sylvia brush your hair and tell you how to live your life. Thank them for saving you. You have to feed their ego until they are so full of themselves that they stop looking for the knife in your hand." Natalie took a deep breath. Her grip on the plastic bag tightened until her knuckles turned white. She dropped it into her purse, hiding it beneath the expensive truffle oil she had been sent to fetch. "I can do it," she said. Her voice was no longer shaking. "I will fix the bear. I will put it back in Mia's bed." "And then what?" "Then," I said, "you wait for the signal. Tonight, when the house is quiet, you need to have a conversation near that bear. You need to talk about money. Specifically about a secret stash that doesn't exist. You are going to tempt them into making a move that they cannot take back." She nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a soldier reporting for duty. "I will make them pay for what they did to Daniel," she promised. She turned her cart around, the wheels squeaking slightly on the linoleum. She didn't look back at me. She walked toward the checkout counter to buy the groceries for her captors, playing the role of the dutiful daughter one last time. I watched her go, feeling a heavy weight settle in my stomach. I had just sent a sheep back into the wolf's den, but this time the sheep was armed. I pulled out my phone and texted Leonard. "The asset is in play. Get the recording equipment ready. Tonight is going to be a long night."
Dưới đây là nội dung chi tiết cho đoạn 18. Được viết bằng tiếng Anh, tối ưu cho giọng đọc AI, giàu cảm xúc, không ký tự lạ, liền mạch, tiếp nối mạch truyện kịch tính của đoạn trước.
I watched Natalie's car merge back into traffic, a lone silver speck carrying a nuclear warhead back to the Harrington estate. She was the inside man. Now, I needed to be the besieging army. I climbed back into the passenger seat of the van. Leonard was already typing, his face illuminated by the blue glow of 3 different monitors. "Is she solid?" Leonard asked, not looking away from the screen. "She is terrified," I replied, buckling my seatbelt. "Which makes her dangerous. She will do it. Now get me that number for the asset management firm, the one holding the foreclosure note." Leonard hesitated. His hand hovered over the phone. "Bill, are you sure about this? We are talking about liquidating everything. Your pension, your savings, the emergency fund you put aside for your own long-term care. If this goes sideways, if the Harringtons find a loophole, you are going to be destitute. You will be living in that truck." I looked at him. I looked at the surveillance feed on the screen, showing the front gate of the mansion where my granddaughter was being held prisoner by people who viewed her as a line of credit. "Make the call, Leo," I said softly. "Money is just paper. Family is blood." 10 minutes later, I was on the phone with a broker from a distressed asset firm in New Jersey. He sounded bored, the voice of a man who spent his days selling the wreckage of other people's dreams. When I told him I wanted to purchase the debt portfolio of Richard and Sylvia Harrington, he actually laughed. "You want to buy the Harrington note?" he scoffed. "Sir, with all due respect, that paper is toxic. They are negative equity. We are scheduled to auction the property in 30 days just to recoup closing costs. You would be buying a sinking ship." "I am not buying the ship," I told him, watching the digital numbers on my banking app. "I am buying the captain's chair. Send me the wire instructions. I am offering you $160,000, cash, today. That is 20% more than you will get at a sheriff's auction." There was a silence on the other line, the sound of greed calculating risk. "Done," the broker said. "I will send the contract. Once the wire clears, you are the lien holder. Good luck evicting them. They have lawyers." I hung up. My hands were steady as I authorized the transfer. I watched the balance of my life savings drop to 0. 40 years of hard work, overtime shifts, and frugal living vanished in a single click. I felt a momentary pang of fear, the primal fear of an old man facing poverty. But it was instantly replaced by a surge of power. The printer in the back of the van whirred to life, spitting out the confirmation of assignment. I picked up the warm paper. It was just a few sheets of legal jargon, but in my hands it weighed more than gold. This wasn't just a debt instrument. It was the deed to their kingdom. I turned to Leonard. "It is done. I own their mortgage. I own their credit lines. I own the chair Richard sits in and the bed Sylvia sleeps in." Leonard smiled, a rare predatory expression. "So, do we evict them now?" "No," I said, placing the document carefully in my jacket pocket. "Not yet. We wait for Natalie to set the bait. Tonight, we let them think they have won. And tomorrow, at the country club, we remind them that the landlord is coming to collect. Drive me to the bank, Leo. I need to withdraw $75,000 from my secret account for legal fees. It is time to suit up." The smell of melting solder filled the small cargo hold of the surveillance van. I worked under a magnifying lens, my hands moving with a precision that defied my age. This was the final modification. I removed the simple storage card and soldered a high-frequency transponder directly onto the motherboard. This was no longer just a passive recording device. It was a live broadcast unit. It would beam every whisper, every gasp, and every confession directly to the hard drive sitting on Leonard's lap 300 yards away. I stitched the seam closed for the second time that week. The bear looked innocent. It looked like a soft, furry friend that a grandmother would give a child. In reality, it was the wiretap that was going to bring down an empire. I handed it to Natalie. She held it like it was made of glass. "You have to be natural," I told her, my voice stern but steadying. "Walk in. Apologize for being late. Give them the truffle oil. Then go upstairs and give this to Mia. And then wait for the signal." She nodded, tucking the bear deep into the reusable grocery bag, burying it beneath a head of organic lettuce and the jar of expensive oil. I watched her walk back to her car. She looked fragile from the outside, a woman broken by her parents' dominance. But I knew she was running on pure adrenaline. She was carrying the detonator into the bunker. The drive back up the hill must have felt like a funeral procession to her. Through the long-range camera, Leonard and I watched her pull up to the gate. The guard waved her through without looking up. She was just the daughter. Just a piece of furniture in their grand design. Inside the house, the air was stagnant. Sylvia was waiting in the foyer, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "You took your time," she snapped, snatching the grocery bag from Natalie's hands. "I hope you bought the right brand. I cannot make the risotto with cheap oil." Natalie's heart must have stopped. I watched the audio levels spike on the monitor in the van. Sylvia dug through the bag. Her hand brushed against the fur of the bear. I held my breath. If she pulled it out, if she asked why Natalie had the bear when it was supposed to be in Mia's room, the story would fall apart. But Sylvia just grabbed the oil and the vegetables. She didn't care about the rest. She didn't care about anything that didn't directly serve her immediate needs. "Take your things upstairs," she dismissed Natalie with a wave of her hand. "And wash your face. You look haggard. We have guests coming tomorrow for the announcement, and I will not have you looking like a ghost." Natalie exhaled, a sound I picked up on the hidden microphone she was wearing on her blouse. She walked up the grand staircase, her legs feeling like lead. She pushed open the door to the guest suite where they were keeping Mia. My granddaughter was sitting on the bed, staring out the window at the high walls that kept her father out. When she saw Natalie, she didn't smile. "Where is he?" she asked. Natalie pulled the bear from the bottom of the bag. "He just needed a little stitching," she lied, her voice trembling slightly. "Grandpa William fixed him." Mia grabbed the bear, hugging it tight to her chest. The bear that was now live. The bear that was now listening to everything. Natalie looked into the camera lens hidden in the bear's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The Trojan horse was inside the walls. The trap was set. Now, we just needed to make them hungry enough to bite. The digital signal from the bear's new transponder was crystal clear. In the van, Leonard adjusted the volume on the receiver. We could hear the ambient hum of the Harrington central air conditioning, and then the sound of a door closing. "It's showtime," I whispered. Back in the guest room, Natalie sat on the edge of the bed. She took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to the bear sitting on the nightstand. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number that went straight to a voicemail box we had set up for Daniel. But she spoke as if he were on the line. "Daniel," she said, her voice pitched high with fake anxiety. "Daniel, pick up. I cannot talk long. My parents are downstairs. Listen to me. We need money. Real money. The lawyers are saying it is going to cost hundreds of thousands to fight this custody battle." She paused, listening to the silence of the room, letting the tension build for the hidden microphone. I remembered something, she continued, leaning closer to the bear. Remember that old story your dad used to tell? About the safety deposit box in the old shed behind his house? The one he kept from his days in the Middle East? He told me once, when he was drunk, that he kept a bag of uncut diamonds in there. Leonard and I exchanged a look. It was a classic bait. Diamonds. The ultimate currency for desperate people. Untraceable, high value, easy to move. Natalie's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. He said he was saving them for a rainy day. Well, it is pouring now, Daniel. If you can get into that shed tonight, before the police freeze his assets, we could pay for the best defense team in the state. We could run away. Just get the diamonds. The combination is his birthday. She hung up the phone. It was a flawless performance. She had planted the seed of greed in soil that was already fertile with desperation. Downstairs, in the master study, Richard Harrington was sitting at his desk, wearing a pair of high-end, noise-canceling headphones connected to his own receiver. We couldn't see him, but we could hear him. The audio feed from the bear picked up a sudden movement, the sound of a chair scraping back violently. Did you hear that? Richard's voice came through our speakers, not from the bear, but from the bug Leonard had managed to plant on his car earlier that day. Diamonds, Sylvia's voice replied. She sounded breathless. Uncut diamonds. That old fool. I knew he was hiding something. He is not going to use them for a lawyer, Richard sneered. He is going to use them to disappear. If he liquidates those stones, we will never see a dime of that trust fund money. We have to get them first, Sylvia said. Tonight, before Daniel gets there. I leaned back in the van, a cold smile touching my lips. They weren't thinking about the law. They weren't thinking about Mia. They were thinking about salvation. And like all rats, they were about to run straight for the cheese, unaware that the trap had already snapped shut. The shed was unlocked. The safe was waiting. And inside wasn't a fortune in gems, but the paperwork that would end their charade forever. The silence in the surveillance van was broken by the sound of Richard Harrington crashing around his study. Through the high-fidelity speakers, the sound of his heavy leather chair scraping against the hardwood floor sounded like a thunderclap. I watched the audio waveform on the monitor spike red, matching the erratic rhythm of his breathing. Did you hear that? Sylvia's voice cut through the static, sharp and hungry. She wasn't whispering anymore. The pretense of the elegant society hostess had vanished, replaced by the raw desperation of a junkie looking for a fix. Uncut diamonds, Richard. Do you have any idea what those could be worth on the black market? I heard the sound of Richard pacing, his footsteps heavy and fast. If the bag is as big as she said, it could be $500,000, maybe more, he muttered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. That clears the interest on the bridge loan. It gets the bank off our backs for 6 months. It buys us time to access the girl's trust fund properly. I leaned forward, adjusting the gain on the microphone. This was it. The moment a human being decides to cross the line from desperate to criminal. But we have to move fast, Sylvia urged, the sound of glass clinking suggesting she was pouring herself another drink to steady her nerves. Daniel knows about it. If he gets to that shed first, if he takes those stones and runs, we are finished. We will be on the street by Monday. It is not stealing, Richard said, and I could practically see him adjusting his cufflinks, trying to rationalize the felony he was about to commit. It is safeguarding family assets. William is senile. He doesn't even know what he has. We are just redistributing the capital to where it is needed most. I looked at Leonard. He was shaking his head, a grim smile on his face. They were rewriting reality in real time to suit their conscience. I heard the distinct sound of a desk drawer sliding open. Then, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The heavy, metallic slide of a pistol slide being racked back. "I am going over there," Richard announced. "The shed is behind the main house. It is dark. I can park on the service road and cut through the woods." "Do you need the gun?" Sylvia asked, her voice wavering slightly. "Just for protection," Richard replied, his tone hardening. "Daniel is unstable. You heard the tapes. If I run into him, I have the right to defend myself. I am a grandfather protecting his family's future." I sat back in the darkness of the van, the cold smoke of my cigarette curling around the monitors. They had swallowed the hook so deep it was scraping their stomach lining. Richard wasn't just coming to steal. He was coming armed, prepared to use violence to secure his stolen lifestyle. The stakes had just escalated from burglary to armed robbery. "Let him come," I whispered to the screen. "The shed is open, the safe is waiting, and the only thing he is going to find in the dark is the end of his career." "Leonard, start the engine. We need to be in position before he crosses the property line." The digital clock on the microwave read 2:14 in the morning. The house was silent, a heavy, suffocating quiet that usually signifies sleep, but tonight it felt like a held breath. I moved through the kitchen without turning on a single light, navigating by memory and the faint gray glow filtering through the curtains. I was not wearing my pajamas. I was dressed in dark cargo pants, a black turtleneck, and my boots were laced tight. This was not a night for rest. It was a night for work. I stepped out the back door, the cool night air hitting my face like a damp towel. The fog had rolled in thicker than I expected, swirling around the ankles of the oak trees in the yard. It was perfect cover. Nature was conspiring to help Richard make his mistake. I walked across the damp grass to the old woodshed that stood at the edge of the property line. It was a weathered structure, smelling of motor oil and sawdust, the place where I tinkered with engines and fixed broken toys. To Richard, it was a treasure chest. To me, it was a mousetrap. I reached for the security keypad mounted on the doorframe. I didn't enter the code to arm it. Instead, I punched in the override sequence that disabled the silent alarm and the motion sensors. The small red light turned green. The perimeter was now open. I reached down and unlatched the heavy iron padlock, leaving it hanging open on the hasp. I pulled the door ajar just an inch, enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. An invitation. Then I walked to the back gate, the one that led to the service road behind the subdivision. I slid the bolt back and pushed the wood gate open. It creaked slightly, a sound that would have made a younger man nervous, but to my ears, it was just the sound of the stage being set. I went back inside the shed and pulled a metal folding chair into the deepest corner, behind the stack of winter tires and the lawnmower. I didn't hide. I just blended into the shadows. I poured a cup of coffee from the thermos I had brought, the steam rising invisible in the dark. I took a sip, the bitter heat sharpening my senses. I wasn't angry. Anger makes you sloppy. I was focused. I thought about the man who was currently creeping through the woods, clutching a gun he probably didn't know how to use properly, driven by a greed so consuming it had eaten his morality. Richard thought he was the predator tonight. He thought he was coming to raid a senile old man's stash. He had no idea that he was walking into a room with a man who had spent 40 years waiting in the dark for people much more dangerous than a bankrupt real estate developer. I checked my watch. 2:30. The timing was right. Then I heard it, the crunch of dry leaves under a heavy, expensive shoe. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Then came the soft, rhythmic panting of a man who was out of shape and running on adrenaline. I set my coffee cup down on the workbench without making a sound. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the sliver of moonlight coming through the door. The guest of honor had arrived. The beam of the tactical flashlight cut through the dusty air like a scalpel, erratic and shaking. Richard stepped into the shed, his expensive Italian loafers crunching on the oil-stained floorboards. From my vantage point in the deep shadows behind the stack of winter tires, I could smell him. It was the sour, metallic scent of fear mixed with expensive cologne. He didn't look like the master of the universe now. He looked like a desperate animal cornered in a cage of his own making. He swept the light across the room, the beam passing inches from my face. But his tunnel vision was so severe he didn't see me. He only had eyes for one thing. He spotted the heavy iron safe in the corner, partially covered by a greasy tarp. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a noise of pure greed. He didn't check the perimeter. He didn't check for traps. He rushed toward the safe, dropping to his knees in the sawdust, ruining the fabric of his trousers without a second thought. I watched as he tried the combination Natalie had given him. He spun the dial, left to 10, right to 24, left to 8. He pulled the handle. Locked. He tried again, his fingers fumbling, sweat dripping from his nose onto the cold metal. Locked. The combination was fake, of course. There never was a birthday code. Richard let out a curse that echoed in the small space. He didn't have the patience to try again. He stood up, scanning the workbench frantically until his eyes landed on my heavy-duty pry bar. He grabbed it, the tool looking alien in his manicured hands. He didn't work the lock with finesse. He attacked it. He wedged the tip of the bar into the gap of the door and heaved with all his weight. Metal screeched against metal, a high-pitched shriek that sounded like a wounded bird. He grunted, his face turning purple with exertion, veins bulging in his neck. He struck the locking mechanism again. And again. It was a violent, ugly display of entitlement. He believed the world owed him what was inside that box, and he was willing to break reality to get it. With a final, deafening crack, the old locking bolt gave way. The heavy door swung open, hitting the side of the shed with a dull thud. Richard dropped the pry bar. It clattered to the floor, forgotten. He fell back to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He shone the flashlight into the dark cavern of the safe. His hand reached in, trembling, fingers curled in anticipation of the velvet bag of diamonds he had been promised. He grasped something, but it wasn't the heavy, shifting weight of stones. It was light. It was paper. He pulled it out, confusion warping his features. It was a single, thick manila folder. There were no diamonds, no gold bars, just a stack of documents. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He set the flashlight on the floor and flipped the folder open. I watched his eyes scan the top page. It wasn't a random document. It was the assignment of debt contract I had signed hours ago. He flipped to the next page. The foreclosure notice. The next page, a list of every credit card he had defaulted on. His hands started to shake so violently the papers rattled. He wasn't looking at a treasure. He was looking at his own obituary. He was looking at the undeniable proof that his debt had been purchased, consolidated, and was now held by a single entity. He froze. his brain trying to process the nightmare, realizing that the predator had just walked into the slaughterhouse. The beam of the flashlight trembled violently against the yellowing paper. Richard read the document once, then twice, then a third time, his brain refusing to accept the reality of the words printed in bold black ink. Notice of assignment of debt. It was a standard legal header, boring and bureaucratic, but the names listed below it were a death sentence. The transfer of $4.5 million in liabilities from the distressed asset firm to a private individual. And there, at the bottom of the page, signed in a steady, unpretentious hand, was the name of the new creditor. William Carter. Richard dropped the paper as if it were burning his skin. It fluttered to the dirty floor of the shed, landing next to his mud-stained knees. He scrambled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked wheezes. There were no diamonds. There was no secret stash of uncut gems from the Middle East. There was only this: a receipt. A receipt that said the man he had mocked, the man he had called a peasant and a failure, now owned every single brick of his life. He frantically reached back into the safe, his hands clawing at the empty metal walls, hoping against hope that this was a decoy, that the velvet bag was hidden behind the papers. But his fingernails only scraped against cold steel. The safe was empty. The trap was full. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a harsh vibration against his hip. It was Sylvia. He stared at the screen, her name glowing in the darkness. He knew exactly what she was doing. She was pacing the study, glass of wine in hand, already mentally spending the money he was supposed to be stealing. If he told her the truth, if he told her that they had been outsmarted by a retired security guard, she would not offer him comfort. She would destroy him. She would look at him with that withering, aristocratic disappointment that terrified him more than bankruptcy. She would see him as a failure, a fool, a man who had let himself be bought by the help. He couldn't do it. His ego, bloated and fragile, would not allow it. He snatched the papers from the floor, crumpling them into a tight ball. He shoved them deep into the inside pocket of his jacket, right next to his pounding heart. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and composed his face into a mask of frustration rather than terror. He answered the phone. "Do you have them?" Sylvia hissed, her voice tight with greed. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "No," he lied, his voice sounding thin in the damp air. "The safe is empty. The old man must have moved them. Or maybe he sold them years ago." "You are useless," Sylvia spat. "Keep looking. Tear that shed apart if you have to." "I can't," Richard whispered, looking at the open door of the safe, feeling the weight of William's signature in his pocket, burning a hole through his chest. The lock was rusted. It made too much noise. "I have to get out of here before I trigger a silent alarm." He hung up before she could argue. He stood up, his legs wobbling like a newborn colt. He didn't look back at the safe. He turned and stumbled out of the shed, fleeing into the night. He thought he was escaping. He didn't know that he was leaving the scene of the crime with the evidence of his own destruction tucked in his coat. And he certainly didn't know that the man who owned him was sitting 10 feet away in the darkness, sipping coffee and watching him run. The flannel shirt landed in the wastebasket with a soft thud. It had served its purpose well. For years, it was the camouflage of a harmless suburban grandfather, a costume that told the world I was irrelevant, slow, and soft. But today, the camouflage was no longer needed. Today, I was going to war, and a soldier does not march into battle in his gardening clothes. I reached into the back of my closet, and pulled down the heavy canvas garment bag that hadn't seen daylight in a decade. The zipper hissed as I opened it, revealing the charcoal gray bespoke suit I had purchased in London during a diplomatic security summit in the late 90s. It was cut from Italian wool, severe and sharp, the kind of suit that doesn't just fit a man, but commands the space around him. It smelled faintly of cedar and memories. I didn't rush. I shaved with a straight razor, scraping away the gray stubble to reveal the hard line of my jaw. I splashed cold water on my face, watching the water drip into the sink, washing away the fatigue. I put on the white dress shirt, stiff with starch, and fastened the cuffs. My fingers, usually stained with motor oil from the truck, were clean and steady. I tied my tie in a perfect double Windsor knot, pulling it tight against my collar until it felt like a chokehold on my own nerves. I stepped into the trousers and slipped on the jacket. It still fit. It hugged my shoulders like a second skin, reminding my posture to straighten, my chest to expand. I looked in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't the guy who struggled to figure out his smartphone. He was the man who used to walk into rooms full of generals and dictate the terms of engagement. I opened the small velvet box on the dresser. Inside sat a small gold lapel pin, the eagle and globe of the Marine Corps. It wasn't flashy. It was small, understated, and terrifying to anyone who knew what it meant to earn it. I pushed the pin through the lapel of the jacket. It was the final piece of armor. Daniel walked into the room, fumbling with his own tie. He stopped dead in the doorway. He looked at me, blinking, as if a stranger had broken into the house. He had never seen me like this. To him, I was just Dad, the guy who fixed bikes and complained about the weather. He had never met William Carter, the asset. "You look different," Daniel stammered, straightening his own posture instinctively. "I am not different," I said, shooting my cuffs and checking my watch. "I am just visible. Richard and Sylvia think power comes from a credit card limit. They think authority is something you buy at a country club. They are about to learn that real power is presence." I picked up the leather folder containing the assignment of debt paperwork. I didn't put it in a briefcase. I held it in my hand, a weapon ready to be drawn. "Let's go, son," I said, walking past him. "We have a party to crash, and I want to make sure I am looking Richard in the eye when I take his crown." The grand ballroom of the Fairfield Country Club was a monument to excess. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, refracting off crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls above the heads of the local elite. The air smelled of fresh orchids, expensive perfume, and the distinct metallic tang of hypocrisy. Round tables covered in white linen were crowded with the town's power players, bankers, judges, investors, all sipping champagne and nodding sympathetically at the stage. In the center of the spotlight stood Richard and Sylvia Harrington. They looked the part of the beleaguered saints perfectly. Richard was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car, and Sylvia was draped in a cream-colored dress that projected an image of maternal softness. Between them, looking small and terrified in a stiff lace dress, stood Mia. She was clutching the teddy bear so tightly her knuckles were white. Richard gripped the podium with both hands, leaning into the microphone with a practiced gravity. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice dropping an octave to convey deep emotion. "Thank you for gathering here on such short notice. As many of you know, our family has been going through a private hell. It is never easy to admit that one of your own has failed. It is never easy to step in and say that a father is not fit to raise his own child." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. I watched from the shadows of the double doors at the back of the hall. I saw heads shaking in performative sadness. They were buying it. Every word. "We tried to help Daniel," Sylvia chimed in, placing a hand on Mia's shoulder. "We gave him money. We gave him opportunities. But sadly, instability is a disease that refuses treatment. We could not stand by and watch our beloved granddaughter suffer in a toxic environment any longer. We had to make the hard choice. The moral choice." Richard nodded solemnly. "We have filed for permanent guardianship. It is a burden, yes. We are at an age where we should be retiring to our yacht, not raising a school-age child. But we accept this burden with love, because that is what family does. We protect the innocent." He paused for effect, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. "And to ensure Mia has the stability she deserves, we are launching a new family trust initiative today. A fund that will be managed exclusively by myself and Sylvia to guarantee her future is secure from outside interference." The room erupted in applause. Polite, rhythmic, wealthy applause. They weren't clapping for a rescue. They were clapping for a hostile takeover disguised as charity. Richard beamed, soaking in the adulation. He looked like a man who had pulled off the perfect crime. He scanned the room, making eye contact with the investors he hoped to squeeze for cash later. Daniel stood beside me, his fists clenched at his sides. He was vibrating with rage. He wanted to scream. He wanted to rush the stage, but I placed a hand on his arm. "Not yet," I whispered. "Let them finish the toast. Let them raise the glass. The higher they hold it, the harder it shatters when it hits the floor." We stood there, two ghosts in the back of the room, watching the Harringtons bask in their moment of glory, unaware that the bear in Mia's arms was recording every lie, and the man in the charcoal suit was holding the match that would burn their stage to the ground. The silence in the ballroom didn't last. Richard Harrington was a man who had built his entire life on the ability to spin a disaster into a sales pitch. He saw the badge in Leonard's hand. He saw the grim determination on my face, and he made a split-second calculation. He couldn't fight the police physically, but he could destroy us socially. He could turn the room against us before the handcuffs even came out. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, forced and theatrical. "Well, this is rich," Richard announced into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, do not be alarmed. It seems my son-in-law's father has decided to crash our celebration. And look at him. He is playing dress-up." He stepped out from behind the podium, walking to the edge of the stage, looking down at me with a sneer that twisted his face into a mask of ugly superiority. "I must say, William," he continued, pacing like a tiger, "that is a very nice suit. Did you rent it for the day? Or did you find it at a thrift store? It is almost convincing. Almost. But you can put a tuxedo on a stray dog, and it is still just a stray dog." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. They were relieved. They wanted to believe Richard. They wanted to believe that the interruption was just a pathetic attempt by a lower-class relative to cause a scene, not a federal investigation. Richard fed off their laughter. He grew taller, more animated. He pointed a finger at me, accusing and sharp. "This man," he shouted, gesturing to the room, "is the root of the problem. He raised a son who doesn't know how to be a father. He raised a failure. And now he marches in here, dragging police officers away from real crimes, trying to intimidate us. But we will not be intimidated. We are Harringtons. We protect our own. He turned to Mia, who was standing frozen by Sylvia's side. He reached down and snatched the teddy bear from her arms. He didn't ask for it. He took it, roughly, ignoring the way Mia flinched. He held the bear up high, gripping it by one leg, dangling it like a trophy. "Look at this," Richard bellowed, shaking the bear. "We gave this to Mia. We gave her toys. We gave her a home. We gave her safety. This bear is a symbol of the life we are providing for her. A life of quality. A life of dignity. While her father offers her nothing but trauma, we offer her comfort." I watched the bear swing back and forth in his hand. The glass eyes were staring directly at the crowd. The hidden microphone inside was picking up every decibel of his arrogance. The transponder I had soldered was beaming his voice directly to the speakers in the van outside, and more importantly, to the tablet Leonard was currently holding behind his back. Richard smiled, a wide, winning smile that showed all his expensive veneers. "Go home, William," he sneered, lowering the bear, but keeping it clutched in his hand like a weapon. "Go back to your garage. Go back to your little life. You do not belong here. You are obsolete. And you are trespassing on property that belongs to people who actually matter." He looked around the room for applause, expecting a standing ovation for his defense of the family honor. He held the bear up one last time, a triumphant gesture. He had no idea that he was holding the very witness that was about to testify against him. He thought the bear was his prop. In reality, it was his judge, his jury, and his executioner. I stood my ground, unmoving, and waited for the echo of his words to die down. It was time to play the tape. Richard was still smiling, that wide, plastic grin of a man who believes he has crushed a bug beneath his heel. The crowd was murmuring, a sea of uncomfortable shifting and whispered judgments, waiting for security to drag the crazy old man away. But I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. The head of security took a step forward, his hand moving to his belt, thinking I was reaching for a weapon. In a way, I was. But it wasn't made of steel and gunpowder. It was a smartphone with a cracked screen, running a custom interface that Leonard had coded that morning. I looked at Leonard, standing near the sound engineer's booth at the side of the stage. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. The country club's audio-visual system was top of the line, expensive, and completely unsecured. It was running on a standard wireless frequency that any first-year computer science student could bridge. For a team that used to dismantle encrypted networks in the 90s, it was like walking through an open door. I tapped the screen of my phone. Execute. A high-pitched squeal of audio feedback tore through the ballroom, sharp and violent as a shriek. The guests covered their ears, wincing in pain. Richard jumped back from the podium, clutching his chest, dropping the bear onto the stage floor. He tapped the microphone furiously. "Is this thing on?" he shouted, his voice small and tinny in the sudden silence. "Someone fix the sound!" But the sound wasn't broken. It had just changed management. I brought my phone to my lips, holding it like a walkie-talkie. When I spoke, my voice didn't just carry across the room. It boomed from the massive array of speakers suspended from the ceiling. It rumbled through the floorboards. It surrounded them. "You are right about one thing, Richard," my amplified voice thundered, causing the crystal chandeliers to vibrate. "You can put a suit on a dog, but it is still a dog. And you can put a tuxedo on a thief, but he is still a criminal." Richard stared around the room, panic wildly dilating his pupils. "Who is doing that?" he screamed at the sound engineer. "Cut his mic! Cut the power!" The engineer was frantically typing on his console, but his screens had gone black, replaced by a single, blinking command prompt. He looked up at Richard and shrugged helplessly. He was locked out. I took a step forward, my voice filling the hall with the authority of God. "You wanted to talk about protection, Richard. You wanted to talk about the sanctity of this family. You stood there and told these people that you were the savior of that little girl." I pointed to Mia, who was looking at the fallen bear on the stage. "But walls have ears, Richard, and so do teddy bears. You thought that toy was a prop, but for the last week, it has been a witness. And it has a very interesting story to tell." I tapped the screen again. The room went deathly silent. Richard lunged for the bear, realizing too late what was happening, but he was too slow. The speakers crackled once, a sound like static electricity, and then the recording began. It wasn't the edited tape of Daniel. It was the raw, unvarnished truth of the night before, played at maximum volume for all of Fairfield to hear. The trial was over. The verdict was about to be read by the defendants themselves. The static from the speakers cleared instantly, replaced by a sound so clear it felt like the ghost of the previous night had materialized in the center of the room. The first thing the audience heard was the unmistakable clinking of ice in a glass, followed by a heavy, exhausted sigh. Then, Sylvia Harrington's voice filled the cavernous ballroom. It was not the polished, melodic tone she had used to charm the mayor only minutes before. It was shrill, slurred with alcohol, and dripping with venom. "I am sick of this," the recorded voice screeched, echoing off the marble walls. "I am sick of pretending to care about that annoying little brat. She is whining about her father again. If she does not shut up, I am going to lock her in the basement." The reaction in the room was physical. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the air. 300 heads turned in unison to look at Sylvia standing on the stage. She had frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended embarrassment. She looked like a statue that was beginning to crack. But the recording was not finished. It was merciless. Richard's voice answered her on the tape, dismissive and cold. "Just give her a pill, Sylvia. Do whatever it takes to keep her quiet until the hearing on Thursday. We just need to get through the court date. I do not want to play mommy," Sylvia's voice snapped back, louder now. "I raised my daughter. I am done. I want my life back." "You will get your life back," Richard's voice promised. "Think of the math, Sylvia. The trust fund yields $40,000 a month. That is $40,000 of free money. That pays the mortgage. That pays the club dues. That gets the loan sharks off our backs. She is not a child, Sylvia. She is a golden goose. We just need to squeeze her until the money comes out." The brutality of the metaphor hung in the air like toxic smoke. A golden goose. In the ballroom, a waiter dropped a tray of champagne flutes. The crash of breaking glass shattered the spell of silence, but no one moved to clean it up. The wealthy elite of Fairfield, people who tolerated greed but despised vulgarity, recoiled in disgust. I saw the mayor slowly take his hand off Richard's shoulder and step away, as if the man were contagious. I saw the bank president lower his eyes, shaking his head. On stage, the facade had completely disintegrated. Richard was frantically waving his arms at the sound booth, screaming silently, his face a mask of purple rage. He looked like a conductor trying to stop a runaway train. Sylvia had collapsed into herself. She wasn't crying. She was trembling, realizing that her social standing, the only currency she truly valued, had just been incinerated in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. Mia stood alone in the middle of the stage, the discarded bear at her feet. She looked at her grandmother, then at the stunned crowd. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked at the bear, and then she looked at me standing in the back of the room. She understood. The bear had told on them. I didn't need to say another word. The recording played on, capturing the sound of them laughing about Daniel's poverty, mocking his job, and planning to send Mia to a boarding school the moment the checks started clearing. Every sentence was a nail in their coffin. They were not just exposed as bad grandparents, they were exposed as monsters who had sold their own flesh and blood for a membership at a country club. The silence of the crowd transformed into a low, angry murmur. The judgment had been rendered, and it was absolute. The silence that followed the recording was shattered not by applause, but by the heavy, authoritative thud of boots hitting the hardwood floor. The double doors at the main entrance were kicked open, and this time there was no ambiguity about who was entering. They did not wear tuxedos. They wore blue windbreakers with bold yellow letters emblazoned on the back and chest. F.B.I. Leonard, standing by the sound booth, finally pulled the badge from his belt and clipped it to his lapel. He raised his voice, cutting through the rising panic of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay where you are. This is a federal operation. Panic rippled through the room like a shockwave. The socialites and bankers, people who had never faced a consequence in their lives, scrambled back from the tables, overturning chairs and spilling wine in a desperate bid to distance themselves from the stage. They looked at the Harringtons not with pity, but with the terrified realization that they were standing next to a contagion. Richard Harrington looked at the agents swarming into the room. He looked at the investors who were now glaring at him with hatred. And then he did exactly what a coward does when the walls collapse. He abandoned his wife. He didn't check on Sylvia. He didn't look at Mia. He jumped off the side of the low stage, knocking over a flower arrangement in a clumsy, desperate scramble. He bolted toward the kitchen service entrance, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the polished floor. He was running for his life, his eyes wide and white, the look of a fox hearing the hounds. He didn't make it 10 yards. 2 agents stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains of the service hallway. They didn't even have to draw their weapons. Richard, blinded by panic, ran straight into them. He bounced off the chest of the lead agent and sprawled onto the red carpet. It was a pathetic, undignified end to his reign. He scrambled to get up, his hands clawing at the carpet, but the agents were on him instantly. One of them pressed a knee into the small of Richard's back, pinning him to the ground. Richard screamed, a high-pitched, indignant sound that had no place in a room full of dignitaries. "Get off me! Do you know who I am? I am Richard Harrington. I own this town." "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited, his voice calm and bored, the sound of standard procedure grinding Richard's ego into dust. "We advise you to use it. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and violation of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was louder than any gavel. It was a sharp, metallic snap that signaled the end of an era. Richard was hauled to his feet. His tie was crooked, his hair was a mess, and his face was pressed against the floor moments ago. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, searching for anyone who would step in and save him. But the room was staring back with cold, hard judgment. He locked eyes with me. I was still standing in the back, my hands in my pockets, the ghost of a smile on my face. He opened his mouth to shout, to curse, to blame me for his destruction, but the agent shoved him forward. "Move," the agent ordered. As they marched him out past the stunned guests, Richard hung his head. He wasn't the king anymore. He was just a criminal in a dirty suit. The illusion of power had evaporated, leaving only the ugly truth underneath. And on the stage, Sylvia stood alone, trembling, watching her husband be dragged away, realizing that she was the only one left to answer for their sins. The room was still vibrating from the slam of the exit doors where the agents had dragged Richard away. The air felt thin, electric with the aftershock of the arrest. I walked up the few steps to the stage, the wood creaking softly under my boots. I didn't rush. There was no need to hurry anymore. The war was over, and now it was time to survey the battlefield. Sylvia was standing by the podium, clutching the edge of the wood as if it were the rail of a sinking ship. She looked at me, her face a ruin of mascara and terror. She didn't have the strength to scream. She just stared, her lips trembling, trying to process how the gardener she had mocked had just dismantled her entire existence in under 10 minutes. "You ruined us," she whispered, the microphone picking up her broken voice and amplifying it to the silent room. "You destroyed this family." I stopped in front of her. I looked her in the eye, seeing the hollowness behind the socialite mask. "I did not destroy anything, Sylvia," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I simply turned on the lights. You destroyed yourself when you decided my granddaughter was a paycheck instead of a person." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the leather folder. I opened it slowly, placing the documents on the podium, right on top of Richard's prepared speech about family values. The paper was crisp and white, a stark contrast to the lies that had been spoken there minutes ago. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, tapping the page with my index finger. Sylvia shook her head, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that didn't exist. "This is a notice of default," I announced, addressing the room but keeping my eyes on her. "And this is a transfer of lien. Yesterday afternoon, I purchased the entirety of the Harrington debt portfolio. I own the mortgage on your estate. I own the lease on your cars. I own the credit line that paid for this party." A gasp went through the crowd. The bankers in the room leaned forward, understanding instantly what this meant. The social power dynamic had just flipped upside down. "Technically, the bank was going to give you 30 days to pay," I continued, my voice hardening. "But as the new private lien holder, I have found evidence of criminal asset mismanagement. That gives me the right to accelerate the debt." I leaned into the microphone, making sure every person in the back row could hear the verdict. "I am calling the loan due, Sylvia. Right now. In full. $4.5 million. Can you write a check today?" Sylvia made a small, choking sound. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "We need time. We have assets." "You have nothing," I corrected. "You are insolvent. And because you cannot pay, I am exercising my right to immediate possession of the collateral to recover my investment." I looked out at the stunned crowd. "This party is over. The champagne you are drinking is now my property. The venue rental is charged to my account. And as for the estate," I turned back to Sylvia, "you have until sunset to vacate the Oaks. You can take your clothes and your personal toiletries. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the jewelry, the vehicles, stays. It is all being seized to satisfy the judgment." You are not just bankrupt, Sylvia. You are homeless. I closed the folder with a sharp snap. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I picked up the folder and turned away from her. I didn't wait for her to beg. There was no mercy left in the tank. I walked over to where Mia was standing, looking small and confused amidst the wreckage of her grandparents' ego. I held out my hand. "Come on, Mia," I said gently, my voice softening for the first time. "Let's go home. Your dad is waiting for you. And we have a lot of packing to do. But not for us." The daffodils were beginning to push through the soil in the backyard. It had been 30 days since the chaos at the country club. 30 days since the police sirens faded and the cameras stopped flashing. The silence that settled over our small house was not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear that used to live here. It was a light, breathing silence. It was the sound of a family exhaling after holding its breath for years. I sat on the wooden bench near the vegetable patch, wiping dirt from my hands with a rag. I wasn't wearing the Italian suit. That was back in the garment bag, zipped tight and pushed to the back of the closet, likely never to be seen again. I was wearing my old flannel shirt, the one with the frayed collar, and my knees were stained with mud. To the neighbors walking their dogs, I was just William the retiree, the old man who spent too much time fussing over his tomato plants. And that was exactly how I wanted it. On the porch swing, Mia was pushing herself back and forth, her feet dangling in the air. Beside her sat the bear. He looked different now. The night after the party, I had taken him down to my workbench for one final surgery. I carefully cut the stitches I had made. I removed the motherboard, the battery pack, the microphone, and the antenna. I pulled out every piece of cold, hard technology I had implanted in him. Then, I stuffed him with extra cotton, making him soft again. I sewed him up with care, using a thread that matched his fur perfectly. He wasn't a spy anymore. He wasn't a witness. He was just a bear. A soft, dumb, lovable toy that could keep a secret without recording it. Mia hugged him tight, whispering a story into his ear. And for the first time, I knew no one else was listening. Through the open kitchen window, I could see Daniel and Natalie. They were preparing lunch together. It was a slow, tentative dance. The damage the Harringtons had done to their marriage was deep, and trust does not grow back overnight. It takes time, like a garden. But I watched as Daniel chopped vegetables and Natalie stirred a pot on the stove. At one point, Daniel reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, just for a second, a small smile touching her lips. They were healing. They were remembering why they fell in love before the money and the manipulation tried to tear them apart. As for the estate, it was empty. The bank had taken possession the day after the arrest. I signed the rights over to a charitable trust, washing my hands of the tainted asset. Richard was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, denied bail due to flight risk. Sylvia was living in a small rented apartment 2 towns over, learning for the first time in her life how to grocery shop on a budget. They were ghosts to us now, fading nightmares that lost their power the moment the sun came up. I picked up my trowel and dug it into the earth. The soil was cool and rich. I planted a row of seeds, covering them gently. I wasn't a soldier today. I wasn't a hacker or a strategist. I was just a grandfather. I looked up at the sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for decades, the hypervigilance that kept me awake at night, was gone. My watch had ended. The perimeter was secure. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true wealth is not measured by the balance in a bank account, but by the strength of the bonds we share with our family. The Harringtons believed that their status made them untouchable, but they underestimated the unstoppable force of a grandfather's love. It teaches us that dignity and truth are the only foundations that last, while castles built on greed and lies will always crumble. Never mistake silence for weakness, because the quietest protectors are often the most dangerous when their loved ones are threatened. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the silent heroes in your own life, please share it with a friend and follow our channel for more emotional tales of justice and redemption.